Today we shall discuss the history of non-fiction cinema, and I shall give special emphasis on the evolution of non-fiction cinema with particular reference to different kinds of films within that genre. It is to be noted that there is a distinction between fiction films and non-fiction films, and usually in the mindset of the moviegoers, the dominant space is occupied by what is known as fiction films. Now, fiction films can be defined in a way which also leads to the definition of non-fiction cinema. Because by fiction films, we mean that there is a kind of story which lies at its heart, or at least there is a theme or some kind of a plot around which all the different events move on, and these different events are usually concocted. Alongside that, the concoction also comes from the position of the camera, the mise en scène, that is, all things that go into making a particular scene, like lighting, costume, and also different kinds of positions of the actors and actresses. They were acting, and all these things. Also, mind you, that there is something called editing, which makes and can make the greatest manipulation in any kind of film. Having said that, I must also come to the point that the non-fiction film at a nominal level would mean that the film is not a fiction film, but that's a nominal definition. A more precise definition would be a film that is least interventional or least manipulative in the sense of, making the film and also showing something which is by and large a recording, sometimes called a neutral recording, of events that are happening before the camera, in fact. Now, is that possible? Can really someone make a film which is non-fiction and which is neutral, so to say? Because, as I said a little earlier, that by the very fact you position a camera, you are being selective and you are choosing something which is not really neutral. You are being very, very selective and very manipulative in a sense. Also, the angle of the camera is important. Added to that is also the different kinds of background situations and also the different kinds of camera movements that come in. So, even at the point of recording, the film may not be what we call neutral. Now, this has given rise to something which is not only mere recording and therefore what has come to be known as documentary, but what is also non-documentary and at the same time non-fictional. Because within the non-fiction genre or subgenre, if you call it, there is something which is called the documentary, and that occupies the dominant space within non-fiction films. Now, documentary is, as the word suggests, mere documenting certain situations, certain experiences, certain happenings before the camera. At the same time, it may so happen that you are not really recording some happenings or events that is taking place, but you are recording some kind of an emotion, some kind of feeling, some kind of an abstract situation. So that leads to other kinds of non-fiction films. We shall cover all these things gradually, but let me start with documentaries. The documentary film is as old as the history of cinema itself, because the history of cinema dates back to 1895, as most people usually agree, when the Lumiere brothers started making films. And the Lumiere brothers, in fact, were making a kind of film that is what people usually started calling mere recording, because they were making one reeler or two reelers. In fact, the first film that was shown in 1895 by Louis Lumiere was called Sortie des Usines, a French title, which, because Lumiere brothers were French people. But this film, the Sortie des Usines, which in English should mean workers leaving the Lumiere factory was really shot in front of their own factory, and the workers were leaving the factory, and that was simply recorded by a camera, which I would say at that point of time was really least manipulative, because the Lumiere brothers were experimenting with this new innovation of the camera, which can record movement that is happening before itself. Earlier there were still photographies, but then came this movie camera. And this was followed by a series of other films, which are all one-reelers or two-reelers. And these films were also, by and large, recording some kind of a reality or other, some kind of a happening before the camera or other. For instance, some of the more widely known films includes a film called The Train at the Station, Le Train à la Gare. And that film, in fact, created a scare among the spectators, because the spectators for the first time felt, in fact, were taken aback by a moving train coming straight onto them, and they raised a hue and cry. And that became the film, a one-reeler film, which is simply momentary capture of a particular event, that is a train entering into a station. This kind of film they were making, but then gradually they also introduced some kind of manipulation in those kinds of two-reelers or whatever, these miniature films. And one such film is L'arroseur arrosé, or The Waterer Watered. In fact, that shows a gardener who's trying to water the garden, but then a young prank comes up, and then he manipulates the pipeline and waters in fact drenches the gardener himself. So that kind of a manipulation also started early on. It was a contemporary fellow Frenchman by the name of Georges Méliès, who also was experimenting with the camera. And in fact, Méliès himself, being a magician, was also interested in manipulating whatever is seen by the naked eye. And therefore, he was creating some kind of an illusion of the experiences. Now, obviously, something which gradually came to be known as fiction films started off its journey, as people usually say, from Georges Méliès. And the Lumiere trend gradually matured into what people started calling documentaries. And obviously, there was a marriage between the two, which led to the growth and development of different other kinds of non-fiction films. We shall discuss those kinds of non-fiction films a little later, but let me mention, to quench your thirst, about what those were. Those were different kinds of, experimental films, abstract films. All these things came up much later, but documentary had a long journey before that. What kind of a journey? Let's start with the 1910s, maybe. That is the early part of the 20th century. And in the early part of the 20th century, we had started with different kinds of what is called travelogue films, travel films or travelogue films. In fact, one big name here is Robert Flaherty, an American who was making amazing films, and that too long films, which looks like documentation of life and livelihood of very exotic people, or some people who live not within the hinterland, but in the peripheries of different countries, or in some remote corner of a particular country. And these were usually people who are indigenous people. So Robert Flaherty, himself being an explorer, started moving, and in fact he was in the habit of moving to places, partly in connection with their business, because they were in the business of furs, and in connection with that he moved to a place called Hudson Bay, which is in fact permanently or perennially snow-clad region in Canada. And there he went into the land of the Eskimos. The outcome was a superb film, a wonderful film, which even now is considered a cult film for travel, in the category of travel films. This film was named Nanook of the North. It soon became a cult film. Nanook of the North also made way for other traveler films like Moana or Louisiana Story. These were also different kinds of films on the local people of Samoa in the Pacific. There was Moana. And Louisiana Story was about the Cajun tribe of the Bayou people in Louisiana. That's a place in America. Now all these films became really a kind of experience which people would love to see time and time again. After that, we can also mention that there had been a whole series of travel films made by different filmmakers. But then I would mention one film here, what is known as The Grass. Now, Grass was a film which was made by three filmmakers, and they were making a film on the experience of the herdsmen who take their herds, their livestock, to the grassy land of Turkey and Persia, crossing mountains and long distances, just in search of grass for their livestock. And that was documented. And the outcome again was very, very fascinating. Similar other films had also been made by others, many others. But I would say that this kind of an experiment, because while making these films, because these were exotic, because these were about indigenous people about whom the mainland people would know very little, and therefore those would arouse a kind of interest and curiosity to know more and more about those people. In fact, here Flaherty has been, right from the days of Flaherty, I would say, some kind of manipulation had crept in, because Flaherty himself had made this thing that in Nanook of the North, in fact, the original film that he made was lost, in fact, that was destroyed by fire, and therefore he made a second version of those people, that is the Innu Indians of Hudson Bay region. And therefore, the Nanook of the North, which we see today, where he went for the second time and recorded their life and lifestyle, he also there manipulated something and made some scenes which were really an intervention into what we otherwise call, within quotes, neutral documentation or recording of real experience. This neutrality was broken by Flaherty himself early on, and in fact he introduced, he showed a transistor over there, gave them that thing, and that became a kind of fascinating thing for them. This was an intervention, because in their own lifestyle it would not be there. These kind of things had continued over the years. In fact, they have grown in years. And later on, in travel films, different other kinds of manipulations have been made. Flaherty had been called a romantic of non-fiction films, a romantic filmmaker, because of his obsession and his, in fact, his engagement with the exotica and the people about whom people know very little. I would also here mention other kinds of films which were also good and in fact very important additions to the history of non-fiction cinema. One such thing is newsreel. Again, I'm talking about newsreel because newsreel is largely believed to be a kind of neutral recording, so to say, because those who see newsreels believe that this is news about what is really happening in reality. And these kind of films had their heydays during the war years, the First World War and the Second World War. Because during the war years, what is happening in the war field what is the situation, which country is winning or which country is losing. These kinds of information would be demanded. In fact, people would become and remain very, very curious about what is happening on the war field or the war front. And therefore, that gave rise to very many kinds of documentary films, and before that, newsreels on war films. In fact, one pioneering name here is that of Dziga Vertov. He was a Russian. Dziga Vertov had his original name, which is not Dziga Vertov, but which is Denis Kaufman. He was Denis Kaufman, better known as Dziga Vertov. Vertov, in fact, had been making newsreel for the war, in fact, for Russia. And he was manipulating different kinds of news and devices with his experiments. He is really best known for all kinds of manipulations of the camera and editing techniques, which is beautifully captured in a long, I would call a non-fiction film called Man with the Movie Camera. And that inspired later the filmmakers like Jean-Luc Godard and Santiago Alvarez of Cuba. Godard was from France. All of them got inspired by this film called The Man with the Movie Camera, made by Dziga Vertov. After that, there have been a large number of newsreel films, but newsreels have also been charged with manipulation, because obviously every country would like to show their country winning in the war, or at least making heady progress. And therefore the filmmakers who knew the art of filmmaking very well also knew the art of manipulation very well. Because that is definitionally true, film being a very, very manipulative medium per se. It has the potential, so it had been given full expression during the war years. This was again followed by other films which were not exactly newsreels but documentation of people's lives, people's experiences in different countries. While talking about war films, let me also mention it is not only the two world wars but also other wars and agitations and movements that excited the minds of documentary filmmakers of those days or later days. War films were being made and agitational films were being made by people like Yuri Stevens and Roman Carmen, Santiago Alvarez, because in the 1960s and 70s, Vietnam War became a very, very important phenomenon. And Vietnam War captured the imagination of filmmakers. Santiago Alvarez made Now and 79 Springs, Hanoi, Tuesday the 13th. All these films had been very, very important in the history of documentary cinema. Yuri Stevens was making films like Borinage, which was on the coal miners' agitation against their employers in a Belgium small town. And these film also showed the brutal violence with which the coal miners' strike was crushed. So that was important. Again, he made films on China, the 400 millions, because at that time China's anti-Jap war was going on. And Yuri Stevens went there to capture that experience on his celluloid. At one end, these kind of films were going on. At the same time, more or less in those decades, another kind of film was being made, which was being spearheaded by Denis O'Rourke from Australia, who again was making films on the Australian Aborigines or local indigenous people. And those led to great films like, Half-Life and many of his other films like Shark Collars of Kuntu. Half-Life, of course, had a very important political tinge in it because Denis O'Rourke was making very, very radical comment on the American intervention in those areas, and particularly with the nuclear bomb experimentation. Now, these films also lead me to the discussion of the political propaganda films. Here, the most important and seminal film was Leni Riefenstahl's film Triumph of the Will. In fact, she was asked to record the 1934 annual rally of the Nazi Party, and Hitler gave her a free hand. She took 120 people, including 16 leading cameramen, and lots of other kinds of arrangements, right from infrastructure and every damn thing. And the city of Nuremberg, which was the venue of that film, in fact, was converted into a veritable large-scale studio, so to say. And the outcome was really fascinating, because it was, to borrow some words from Eric Barnu, the very eminent film historian, and particularly very important documentary film historian. Eric Barnu called it an orchestration of images and sounds that was so aptly maneuvered and so efficiently done that it became a landmark in its own genre, created own subgenre also. These films had in fact given rise to later day TV films and sports events documentation in such a way that you had multiple cameras and multiple kinds of manipulations going on at the same time, and editing playing a very, very important role. After these, I must come to other kinds of documentary films or non-fiction films, to be more general. That is the abstract films, the experimental films. Let me mention here that artists were showing great interest in the possibilities of films, and people like Hans Richter, Man Ray, all of them started making films. And in fact, there was another filmmaker called Fernand Léger and Dudley Murphy. These two made a film called Ballet Mécanique. Hans Richter's film Racing Symphony is very, very important. Similarly, Man Ray, who made a film called Imam Emak Bakia. All these films, in fact, were creating and, in fact, setting trends for newer and newer films of different kinds. And these led to the films which were now called experimental films, now called abstract films, because there was a lot of abstraction mingled with some kind of a real experience. And these were mingled so well, they became very successful film experimentations. In America, they also called them underground films. And Andy Warhol, who in fact was a very well-known artist, and he gave a new dimension to experimental cinema. Now, these leads to different other kinds of discourse on other kinds of non-fiction film that become very, very important. Let me add before I close this discourse that TV, the advent of technology, in fact, and the improvement of technology, newer and newer technologies, in fact, gave rise to tremendous potential of filmmaking, particularly non-fiction filmmaking. And the BBC films like Planet Earth or Hiroshima, these again created newer subgenres within the non-fiction, because the TV films would be shown as a serial, as a long documentation with lots of technological interventions, and their appeal, their making was completely different from what was hitherto known to all others. Again, I'd also bring in some other kinds of films, that is called, say, the theater films. The theater films are those which actually record a play being staged. Now, the play itself is an event which is being recorded. But again, as I said, while recording, there are manipulations. While editing, there are manipulations, because these are not online real-time recording of the situation. Even in case of online real-time recording, there are some kinds of manipulations as one could expect. So, thank you very much.